Hi, it's Mrs. Martin here to talk to you about genetic variation. We've given you a link here in learn.genetics. The video should help you fill out these notes, but I've also given you this support video to help complete your notes. We're going to explain what genetic variation is, how crossing over leads to higher genetic variation, and why sexual reproduction is still required. Even though asexual reproduction requires less energy, there's got to be some benefit to spending more energy to this sexual reproduction. That's why we've spent some time on mitosis and meiosis, and then we're going to close it out with gene therapy, gene modification, and selective breeding. First of all, genetic variation is the variation of genes passed from parents to offspring. If you remember, humans get 23 chromosomes from their mom and 23 from their dad. In the crossing over, remember on mutations, we went to this slide here. In that first part of meiosis in prophase 1, the chromosomes that are homologous align next to each other and there's some crossing over. You don't want to have an exact replica of the parent generation and the offspring generation. You're actually hoping for some variation so that something like a virus or a bacteria or some event happens that affects the species, that there'll be enough variations that they'll survive whatever it is that happens to the species due to that genetic variation. So that crossing over gives you more variation in the offspring, and then the offspring have crossing over in their generation that they pass to the offspring, and then increased genetic variation increases the ability of the species to survive, hopefully. Now, that's why we spend the energy with sexual reproduction and meiosis, even though it requires more energy than just uh, pollinating a plant is sexual reproduction. Asexual reproduction requires less intensive energy for some species, but it is much more beneficial to have that genetic variation. So let's jump into our analysis activity for the day. In order to do the activity, you need to understand the difference between genetic therapy, gene modification, and selective breeding. So let's start with gene modification. That's where we actually modify the DNA. It's also called genetic engineering. We're trying to enhance what the normal trait you see in the species is to something bigger, better, stronger. So GMOs is something that you may be familiar with. A GMO salmon is much bigger than the regular farmed salmon. You can look at some of the GMO foods here. And then what's shown here is how they actually use bacteria to cut the DNA and insert genes to enhance what trait they're looking for. Now, selective breeding is something you may also be familiar with and just not even realize it. If you have a dog or see all the different species of dogs, selective breeding is the intentional selection of one parent and the other parent to get a trait and to enhance a trait. And because people have done this with dogs in different countries, there's a ton of different species. But you can see also, just from this one plant, how all the selective breeding has created things that are much more appealing to eat to different people. Now, the last thing I want to talk to you about is gene therapy. This is where we have to correct, insert, or modify a gene. Maybe the gene isn't working. Maybe it's a cause of disease. Maybe it's been mutated and the normal gene is not there in the affected individual. We've given you some case studies here, but what they do is they cut the RNA with a virus, a retrovirus, which means it works backwards. So they cut the RNA and then it goes back and modifies how the DNA is within the nucleus. So that retrovirus goes back into the nucleus and inserts the healthy gene into the DNA, which they then extract and put into healthy cells. You can see here an example of a person with a monogenic disease and then what happens to the protein production. If you have any questions as you enter the activity, of plants and how it's done, why it's done, and given an example, use Google, reach out to your teachers on Zoom. Let us know how we can help. I hope you understand why genetic variation leads to positive, negative, and non impactful variations within a species, but ultimately, lots of variation will eventually create a new species. Have a great day.